Today on Stronger Than Reason, we strip it back to bare metal with Nitzer Ebb's debut album, That Total Age. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason, episode 69. Nice. Hopefully you'll find this topic worthy of the number, but let's get back to basics, because when you're talking electronic dance music, it doesn't get more basic than drums and bass. And I don't mean drum and bass, I mean drums and bass. And if you're lucky enough to have an especially good vocalist, that's good enough for a record. And some music of this sort was floating around the underground in the early 80s. Bands like Suicide, Cabaret Voltaire, D-Krups, and DAF, for instance. And around that time, all sorts of labels were floating around this sort of sound, like electronic rock, electronic punk, electro-punk, or even electronic body music, or EBM. But whatever you call it, simple rhythmic music speaks to something primal in all of us. It's one of the things that first attracted me to electronic music. As a kid, I quickly realized that I preferred music that had a prominent beat. And this goes back as far as when I used to play the hell out of my folks' disco 45s, like Hot Stuff and Enough Is Enough by Donna Summer, and, their ABBA LPs. Rock was cool, but to me, beats were better. So after getting into club music as a teen, I suddenly realized how commercial radio was heavily biased towards vocalists and guitarists at the expense of bassists and drummers. And for the most part, standard rock just didn't have much groove to it, although there were some exceptions. And for instance, I got heavily into Creedence Clearwater Revival, and I'm sure that somewhere, somehow, someone has mashed up Green River with P-Funk's Flashlight, and it's probably awesome. But then there was random funk-influenced rock that I heard, like Golden Earring's Twilight Zone, and none of my friends really, except for one stoner buddy, could really understand why I liked that song. They'd say, Golden Earring, weren't they popular in the 70s? But, that breakdown in Twilight Zone is just pure club music. And, that song came out in 1982, not the 70s. It was really a new wave song. But sometime in middle school, I hit that point that a lot of kids hit where they are kind of forced to attend a concert band open house at the school, where you get to walk around the room and look at all the various band instruments. And I'm sure the hope among your parents and teachers is that you'll take a shine to one and begin a lifelong relationship with it. And I'm sure my parents were thinking, preferably something small and cheap, like the piccolo. Sure enough, one instrument did call out to me, and maybe to their dismay, it was the drums. And so for anyone keeping track, my musical training to this point amounted to some piano lessons, despite not having a piano at home to practice on. So I guess it made sense in a way that I chose to learn drums without having a drum or a drum set at home. However, not all was lost, because my school managed to sell me a drum pad. It was a little piece of pine board with a rubber mat glued onto it about yay big, and the idea was that I could play it without driving everyone in the house completely berserk. Of course, it didn't work, because my sister had, and still has, an exceptional sensitivity to even the tiniest noises, like a younger brother's surreptitious drumming and also his chewing and even breathing. Strangely enough, she and I are really good pals now that we are no longer living in the same house. Anyway, even more exciting than the drum pad was that I got my very first set of drum sticks. And I remember they were ProMark 2Bs, and I gotta say, I felt really cool carrying them around the school, because, I had to take them to lessons and band practice and whatnot. So I did stick with the concert band for a couple of years, and it was fun. I don't really recall playing anything as a drummer that was technically challenging, because, this was 8th grade and all. And I think my crowning achievement was the bass drum solo in our cover of Glenn Frey's The Heat Is On. Me with my big upright bass drum really cool, but, I still think of it fondly every time I turn the furnace on. Anyway, I always thought rhythm was where it was at, and I still do for the most part. A lot of the music I love the most emphasizes rhythm in some way, whether it's pop, club, funk, jazz, industrial, or whatever. I've always been less interested in music that's primarily about the vocals, say, or about the guitar, or even worse, singer-songwriters. Ugh. In fact, when we're out looking for live music to catch, I tell my wife that I'm only going if the band has a drum set. No drum set, I'm not there. Forget it. The only time I made an exception to that was when we saw this hotel band that just had a keyboardist, bassist, and a guy playing guitar and singing. And I was ready to write them off. I was halfway out the door. But then, maybe knowing what I was thinking, they launched into a Led Zeppelin cover with the keyboardist playing flawless drums, matching John Bonham's groove perfectly, just playing the drums on the keys. And I had to admit, it was pretty great. I was impressed. So that was okay. But generally, no drum set, no stay. Anyway, as I came of age and started to explore my own musical interests, I naturally gravitated to stuff that was rhythmic, and that included industrial music. Bands like Ministry, 9 Inch Nails, Skinny Puppy, they clearly put a premium on their drums, as opposed to bands like, like Bon Jovi and Van Halen that put a premium on the vocals and the guitars. I just love the huge electronic crunch of industrial drums, plain and simple. Now, clearly, Ministry were dressing it up with a lot of other stuff. There had samples and keyboards on the early records, and then lots of guitar on the later records. And Skinny Puppy, of course, doused their beats in tons and tons of samples and effects. And 9 Inch Nails dressed them up with pop hooks and melodies. But there was one band I came across that really boiled things down like no other and kept things really pure, just a beat, a bass line, and a vocal. And I've often said on this show that simplicity is power, and this band was powerful. They were focused. They knew their goal, fill a club floor and screw everything else. So they didn't have a guitarist, they didn't have a bassist, they didn't have anyone playing those swell keyboard licks. All their music was programmed or involved beating drums in some way. And even more so, they didn't have an ordinary singer, someone who's going to go out there and just hit all the notes and really interpret a range of emotions and project. No. Their singer was like a satanic drill instructor, barking orders, chanting a cadence, growling, spitting, and shouting his way through these tracks. And they really were tracks. They weren't really songs because, with very few exceptions, they didn't much follow the golden rules of pop. So there wasn't much here in the way of ordinary verse, chorus, verse structures. Some might say that it was a bit experimental, but I don't think they put that much thought into it. It was just really stripped way, way back, just stripped to the essentials. And I first heard this record in 1990, 3 years after its release, and I found it really refreshingly direct. It was uncompromising, and it was an excellent example of industrial just cut down to its rhythmic core, just this distillation of electronic tribal aggression. And I would wager to say that even if I hadn't given you that intro, you would still know by this description what band I was talking about here, and even what album. Because as far as industrial and EBM goes, it stands at the end of a continuum. It is an outlier, an extreme point, and I think it would be hard for anyone to make music in this genre that is more simple yet hard-hitting. And I'm just going to say it, folks. You can't dumb it down more than this. This record is speaking directly to your lizard brain. So in psychoanalytic terms, if Pretty Hate Machine is the superego, then Land of Rape and Honey is the ego, and this record is the id. And of course, I'm talking about the seminal English industrial EBM band Nitzer Ebb and their debut studio album from 1987, That Total Age. Now, this band is pretty important to me, and you know this because I talked about them way back in episode 2, second only to Ministry. And that was all about their third album, Showtime, which was the first thing of theirs I ever heard, and which in some ways is still my favorite work of theirs. And then in episode 48, I talked about their second album, Belief, which is maybe what I'd consider their best songwriting, at least in these early albums. And for sure, some of the singles on Belief were arguably just their career high points. They were amazing. So you can see that I'm working backward here, and it was only inevitable that I would eventually get to their first album. It's important to note that Nitzer Ebb were a band that evolved very quickly, and while they had a recognizable sound throughout their career, each album would present it in different combinations. And in general, they started very stripped back here in That Total Age, and by their fourth and fifth albums in the early 90s, they were kind of veering into straight-up pop territory. So they didn't rely on their formula so much as they always were kind of looking ahead at the next thing. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't, as we'll no doubt see when I get around to talking about their later stuff. But none of that matters here. With That Total Age, we have Nitzer Ebb reduced to the core, as an EBM archetype, as it were. So I first heard this album a few months after really getting into Showtime. I think it was before I ever heard Belief, which took me a while to get to. But part of me expected more of that Showtime sound, which was pretty refined. I mean, Showtime has woodwinds on it. There's no woodwinds on this record here. I'm pretty sure this music is 100% synthetic. It's just really drums and bass and vocals, and that's it. And nevertheless, my initial reaction was I really liked it. I had to admit that it was repetitive. As I said, a lot of these songs don't have much in the way of traditional pop structures going on. They generally have one part, and the vocals are mostly chanting and barking the same things over and over, to the point where I have to wonder how the band ever kept things straight when performing these songs live. Like, how do you even know where you are in the song? It all sounds the same. But anyway, we did play this album a lot growing up, and for a bunch of teenage dudes in the early 90s, it met our requirements for mindless aggression. So there was a lot of driving around to this late at night and, occasionally inflicting it on others whenever we were somewhere with a boombox. But, I noticed that only certain kinds of friends would really get into this album because, more intellectual folks, they just weren't into it, let's say. Or, maybe those with a limited appetite for repetition. And these were usually the same kind of uptight people who didn't think Monty Python was funny. Because, after all, most of Monty Python's humor had to do with repetition, right? You had your Spam sketch, your Dead Parrot sketch, the Cheese Shop sketch, and they all hinged on what Hot Chip would later call out as the joy of repetition. And trust me, we'll talk about Hot Chip in a whole other episode someday. But the point is, the album is pretty raw, and it's not for everyone. And that said, I think of all Nitzer Ebb's early albums, it's definitely the most hard-hitting production-wise. After this album, they would bring in Flood to produce, and of course I love Flood. He's a legend, but he had a way of rounding off the corners of the album tracks, and I mentioned this in the Belief episode, how he kind of saved all of his hardest tracks for the singles, and the album versions were kind of watered down, in my opinion. And that is definitely not so here on That Total Age. Phil Harding produced most of these tracks, with a few exceptions we'll talk about. And in my opinion, he produced this album as a collection of club singles, not as an album per se, because I don't think it flows as well as their later stuff. There's just not much dynamic range here. The tracks don't really vary much. You just have two speeds, hard and harder. There's no ballad on this record. There's nothing slow and edgy. There's nothing super experimental, because this is all just hard-hitting club tracks for the most part, all with very similar instrumentation and vocals. And To be honest, I do find this kind of hard to listen to all the way through these days. I tend to play the odd song here and there rather than just play the whole thing. Otherwise, I just kind of get numb to it. It's just a constant pummeling. But back in the day, for sure, hard-hitting beats were just the thing, and I did play this album a lot. I had a really, really high-quality cassette dub of it for years. Still have it, in fact, and I did pick up this CD when I was in college shortly after I got my first CD player. And I'm not going to say this is an audiophile CD because I honestly wouldn't know about that. But I will say that it sounds freaking great coming out of a really powerful sound system. There's just a ton of low end here with nice crisp highs. And the synth bass on here, it's so thick and wonderful. It just fills up the mids. It's like a fine sandwich. You got your fat lows and your crisp highs, just sandwiching the creamy middle. Yeah, that makes no sense at all. Sorry. But it's all good stuff. And yeah, this album was definitely one of my favorites. I also love this album just from a design perspective. So this cover is so iconic. You can bet that we drew these symbols all over our school books and stuff. And, in fact, their first 3 albums are just a masterclass in minimalist design, and even their early singles are really well designed. I know they pulled a lot of their imagery from Eastern European propaganda, and they still do. They did a whole tour in the late 2000s dressed up as capitalists and proletariats and, that whole class warfare kind of imagery. And on this album, it really did make sense. All of these songs sound like the Red Army doing calisthenics in hell. So the visual aesthetic here really does match the sonic aesthetic. And, what more can you ask for in a cover? So who were Nitzer Ebb in 1987? Well, I've talked a lot about the band and the previous 2 episodes about them. The core of this band has always been Doug McCarthy on vocals and Bon Harris on everything else. Though for this album, they still had founding member David Goodday in the mix, helping with drums and programming. So they were a 3-piece here. David would exit after this album and wouldn't return until sometime after the millennium. Meanwhile, they had another founding member, Simon Granger, who was still kind of on board doing their visuals. So we have Simon to thank for all these iconic early record sleeves. And of course, nowadays, both David and Simon are playing live with the band, which is super cool to see. Anyway, I'm not sure what David's contribution to this album really was. They don't really break out the credits that way. Presumably, he helped Bon with the beats and programming. Douglas handles all the vocals here except for one song, which we'll talk about. So keep in mind, too, that these guys were still very young at this point. In fact, as a Gen Xer, they were only a few years older than me, which I definitely did not realize when I was first listening to this. I just assumed they were much older. But when this album came out, Doug and Bon were both just 21. Now, this is their first proper album, but they did make some earlier recordings. They had a series of singles that later got collected onto this compilation, So Bright, So Strong, which I think I mentioned in a previous episode. I did buy this on eBay way back when, but, I'm not as cool as the guy I knew in college who had all the individual singles with all the cool, unique artwork. And that was just a mind blower to me at the time because I didn't know any of that stuff even existed. I had a National Record Mart in my hometown. I didn't have all these cool 12 inches. I didn't know what a 12-inch was. So, anyway, this was a kid, I'm told, used to blow his food budget on music. And then, he'd just get by eating cake frosting and vitamins. And if you think that sounds dumb, just bear in mind that he was, at the time, attending one of the most prestigious engineering schools in the country. Not my school, but one nearby. So, he wasn't a dumb guy. He just had his priorities, And he had a show on his radio station at school, too, and I used to call in and ask him to play Nitzer Ebb, and he was always very pleased to hear that request. So cheers to him. He helped me get some of their earlier material, copies of it to listen to, which I later collected myself. I do kind of wonder what happened to that guy, because he was a character. But yeah, some of these singles go back as far as 1984 when the band members would have just been 18. So if you've been keeping up with my Nitzer Ebb episodes, you'll know that the record label Pylon reissued all of their studio albums with extra tracks. Both Belief and Showtime just had a ton of extra stuff on there, remixes and B-sides, and they did reissue That Total Age, but I never picked up the Pylon copy because it really only added 2 tracks that I don't already have. But Pylon also cleaned up and released a video for the song So Bright, So Strong that was never released earlier. And you got to check it out online. It's just a really low-budget affair that shows the guys doing the song in a friend's family barn. So it was just like, yeah, let's do a video in a barn. Sure, why not? And in fact, the pictures here on the cover of So Bright, So Strong, the collection, are taken from that shoot, and it's crazy to think how young they were, just teenagers. So check out that video if you're interested. They also did have an early live album of sorts. It's called Basic Pain Procedure, and they self-released it on cassette in 1983, and I think since then it's come out on a variety of formats. I think it was something of a demo tape. I find it pretty hard to listen to. I don't think the sound quality is very good at all. But it does exist if you want to check out their earliest stuff. I think it only has one song that appeared in a later studio recording, this track they called Crane, that was on their first single. But back in 1990, though, I had very little info about this band. I had a little bit of hearsay about who they were from a friend who had actually seen them live. I never really saw them on MTV, although I guess they did show up on 120 Minutes now and then, usually the video for Murderous, which is one of the songs on this album. I know that the band did make other videos because they're all on YouTube now, but I definitely didn't see any of the other videos back in the day, at least not for these first 3 albums. So, there was a lot of mystique about them. It wasn't clear who they were or how they did what they did. And their music was just so different. It had its own sound, so it wasn't really easy to visualize what was going on. And some of that would change by the time they came out with their 4th album, Ebbhead, which would bring them a lot more exposure. But we'll get to that some other time. So let's take a closer look here. We talked about the artwork a bit. It's iconic, of course. It looks like a flag. The gear, the star, the hammer. I mean, these look like symbols of the proletariat. Something straight out of Orwell's 1984, maybe. It kind of harkens back to that strident political propaganda or agitprop. And I have no doubt that these symbols are tattooed on thousands of aging Gen Xers, as they should be. So there is a little booklet here, although there's not much in it. They've given each of these symbols a slogan. So you have Forces Machine, Muscle and Hate, and Visions of Order, with a call out on the other side here to Nitzer Ebb Product, which is the band's marketing arm. So again, allusions to 1984 with its war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And then, they have all the credits jammed in here on this back panel, which was the style at the time. And if you look incredibly closely at that FlySpec 2 font, you'll see some familiar names like Paul Kendall, alias PK. Phil Harding produced most of these songs, as I said, except for Violent Playground and Smear Body, which were by someone named Duffy. No idea who that is. Probably not Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses. And, Let Your Body Learn, which was personally handled by Daniel Miller, who, of course, was the Mute Records boss and a musician himself with his band, The Normal. And he had help here from Gareth Jones, who worked extensively with Depeche Mode. And naturally, the Ebb would soon sign to Mute and would get a leg up in the industry by being a regular opener for DM, not to mention becoming friends with those guys and, doing a bunch of collaborations over the years. By the way, this disc looks really cool. And, the back has the track listing. This is the original US CD from Geffen, which licensed it from Mute. And it happens to have 3 bonus tracks that aren't on the original album. So it has extra versions of Join in the Chant, Fitness to Purpose, and Murderous. So the original vinyl album had just 10 tracks, ending with Into the Large Air. But wait a minute, that math doesn't add up. So this CD has 12 tracks, 3 are bonuses, and the original record had 10 tracks, which means we're missing a track here. And it turns out that the missing track is the radio mix of Warsaw Ghetto, which I have collected here on So Bright, So Strong in a couple different versions. But it was a confusing point as a kid because a friend of mine bought the cassette version of that Total Age, and it had Warsaw Ghetto as track 3 right after Violent Playground. And the CD skipped it in favor of all these bonus tracks. So when you were talking about different formats back in the day, believe me, the cassettes were always the ones that they screwed up one way or another. And someday I will have an episode about Rush's Caress of Steel, and we'll have a fun time talking about how jacked up that cassette was. But I really don't get the sequencing on this CD, because eventually a friend of mine made me a tape of Warsaw Ghetto, and I was just stunned because it was a great song, and to not have it on the CD of that Total Age with the proper sound quality and production was just a drag. And I thought it was easily better than some of the other stuff on here, for real. Fortunately, eBay became a thing, and I was able to pick up the So Bright compilation, so now it's not an issue. So I should mention, for the sake of completeness, that the Pylon version has all of the tracks here, plus the album version of Warsaw Ghetto, so it fixes that problem. It has the 12-inch mix of Let Your Body Learn, the 12-inch Fire mix of Join in the Chant, and the 12-inch mix of Warsaw Ghetto for a total of 16 tracks. And again, I never picked that version up. Why? Because I'm a bonehead. And of course it's difficult to find these days, so I can't just snap it up. But again, I generally have all of those tracks from other sources, so I'm really not missing anything except holding it in my own 2 hands. Anyway, let's walk down through the tracks, shall we? We'll get right into it with Fitness to Purpose, which is essentially a workout tape crossed with a military cadence. And I like to think that there's some country, probably in Eastern Europe, who lines up their troops and makes them do calisthenics to this song. I think Doug would have made an excellent drill instructor if he weren't, an 80s skateboard brat turned industrial rock god. The one thing about his vocals is that I can rarely tell what the hell he's saying. So for me, it's more about his delivery than the actual words. They don't have a lyric sheet, obviously, so I don't know what he's talking about. But it sounds good. So he's kind of like Joe Elliott in that regard. But Doug, it's hard for me to join in the chant when I don't know what the chant is, But yeah, this is a song that's like one that you would play on a level 99 aerobics class. It's just an unrelenting beat with shouting and very minimalistic bass on it, just an occasional pulse of bass. And the interest that's here is really coming from Doug's vocals, which are just punctuated with these group shouts. And it comes off very slogan-like, again, like a military rally set to a fast drum track. And for whatever reason, one of the bonus tracks is Fitness to Purpose Mix 2. And I gotta say that to me, it's almost indistinguishable from the original, to the point where I have no idea why they included it here. Frankly, I'd much rather have Warsaw Ghetto than that. So why the title of this track? I like to think that Doug was probably lying on his floor, reading the tag on his mattress, and the legal language there said something about the implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose, which is a phrase you've seen in every product disclaimer and every end-user license agreement. And, Doug's brain scrambled up the words like fitness, blah, 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 to purpose. And he thought, hang on, mate, that's a great title. And I'm sure that's exactly how it happened. So on we go to Violent Playground, which I'm going to be clear, isn't one of my favorites. For one thing, I think it sounds clanky and stiff. And for another, let's just face it, the lyrics are dumb. They're dumb. Not that any of these lyrics would ever win the Pulitzer Prize. but it's just what kids today would call cringe. So here's a sample. Won't you come and join us in our playground? It's such a violent playground, such a violent playground. It's just dumb, okay? I don't know. I never liked this song. Fortunately, this album has plenty of fantastic songs that more than make up for it. So why don't we talk about them instead? We'll talk about Warsaw Ghetto, which normally falls here next as track 3 on the vinyl and the cassette. Of course, it's not on this edition. So it's one of their earlier songs, one of their first singles. I like this song from the start. It's got a great big analog bass line that is fantastic. It's just 3 notes, and it changes up a bit. It alternates a fourth between the F and the A sharp. So with the simple beat and Doug's vocals, there's enough variation there to keep your attention. So I do recommend getting this track on So Bright, So Strong because it has all 4 versions. There's the original 12-inch, the dub, the radio edit, and something called the rap mix, which isn't even close to rap. It's the same vocal track from the other versions. So I have no idea why they called it that. Anyway, Warsaw Ghetto, definitely a top 10 Nitzer Ebb track. And maybe one you missed if, like me, you only had this album on the US CD. So definitely check it out for sure. So here's another fantastic one. Track 3 here is Murderous, and it's definitely my favorite of this bunch. It has what I would argue is the greatest sequenced synth bass line of all time. The intro is amazing. It sounds so good coming out of a loud sound system. The way the song starts with Doug's vocals and the bass line comes in and you're like, ooh, shit. And then the drums hit and they just crush you. So apart from just one little drop in the middle, the song just doesn't stop until it's over. There's one part, no changes. The whole thing is just a big crazy rush. And, back in the day, I'm sure I wore out the tape on that particular song. Just rewinding and playing it over and over. It's just a freaking masterpiece. And they did release it as a single, only on vinyl. It was just Murderous, backed by Fitness to Purpose. And it became a club staple and one of the band's show closers. They made a video for it. It's 3.5 minutes of blurry jump cuts of Doug singing. One of the top 5 Ebb tunes for sure. Maybe one of the top 3 EBM tunes ever. I mean, seriously, it's got to be this song, Headhunter, and Welcome to Paradise, because what else is there? It's just a classic track. And it goes right into Smear Body, which is a really peculiar song. I have to admit, the production is outstanding. The drums and bass just pop right off the recording. They sound fantastic. This is one of them that was produced by Duffy, along with Violent Playground. But this is a much better song. The lyrics, I guess, are just complete nonsense. I mean, I don't know. Who knows? But I kind of dig this song. It has a great beat, a great bass line, has a really slippery hi-hat part, and just fantastic delivery from Doug. And, then we have track 5, which is everyone's favorite, Join in the Chant. I like this song just a bit less than Murderous, maybe because I view it as something of a novelty track, maybe a gambit for crowd participation. And you know how much everyone likes crowd participation, right? But I guarantee that if you know only one Nitzer Ebb track, it's this one. And I'm sure there are still places around the world where the dance floor blows up as soon as it comes on, just like back in the day, because it's a perennial favorite. And of course it was a single too, vinyl only, a variety of remixes, and what a cool cover on it. I think I still have a full-size poster of that deep in my archives that I got in college, back when the poster guys would come. You remember when the poster guys would come and they would set up a stall like in the student union, and they'd only be there for like an afternoon, and everybody would rush in and get all their favorite posters. Well, that's what I did with that. And there's a video for this one as well. Though unlike Murderous, I don't recall ever seeing it on MTV. It's mostly just Doug and Bond bouncing down the street. high on something, life, maybe. It's not even lip synced, so you can play any music you want to that video. And I recommend So What You Want by Beastie Boys. I tried it and it worked really great. What else can you say about this song, though? I mean, Doug does a lot of chanting, for sure. Whole lot of chanting here. Every verse ends in him yelling fire, which is your big chance to yell along. And I do, of course, when I'm listening down here in the bunker, which just confuses my family since they all immediately grab the pets and run down to the curb, which is our emergency meetup spot, only to find that it was just me enjoying some Nitzer Ebb down here, and they are never pleased. A classic song for sure, a crowd pleaser, even if it's not exactly my favorite here. Murderous is just too damn good, but, I'd still prefer this song to, I don't know, anything at all by The Weeknd or Imagine Dragons, for sure, needless to say. So let's move on to Alarm. Again, never much like this one. It's really just a beat, some shouting, and a really annoying clanging sound. Indeed, you might say that it's an alarm of some sort, and fortunately it's followed by one of my absolute favorites, the final single, track 7, Let Your Body Learn, which here on the album is criminally short, just under 2.5 minutes. Whose idea was that? Take one of the best songs and just shave it down to nothing. Meanwhile, you throw an entirely worthless version of Fitness to Purpose on here, and it's just a shame, At least the Pylon version gives you the full 12-inch mix here, which goes on for over 6 minutes. And Let Your Body Learn is a catchy pop tune, and it's probably the only pop tune on here because it's got verses and a chorus, which is really cool, something like actual singing from Doug. And, in my mind, this anticipates the songs they would write on Belief, stuff with a bit more structure and variety. And, I guess they agreed since they released it as another single. Again, vinyl only. All the singles from this album were only on vinyl. And once again, a really cool sleeve. The album cover really lends itself to cool variations like this because it's just so graphic and abstract. So just a really neat design here. I do love this song, though. I would rank it maybe number 2 here, right after Murderous and just before Join in the Chant. So moving right along, we have Let Beauty Loose, which I really like because it's the only tune here that is sung by Bon, not Doug. And I think Bon has a really good voice. The song suits him well, and it sounds really interesting and makes me realize how lucky this band was. So we wind up the album proper with just one more, Into the Large Air. And this is a weird one. The drums are just a steady snare basically through the whole thing, which is kind of an odd choice, I suppose. But there's some cool vocal work here by Doug, and, it takes the album out in style. And of course, this being the United States, they gave us the extra value meal, 3 more songs, the so-called metal mix of Join in the Chant. So imagine the original track, but remove all the drums and replace them with clanging sounds. And that's it. That's the mix. I know, right? Why would you want to do that? Take this classic song and remove the drums? No idea. No clue. So next up is the aforementioned second mix of Fitness Pizza in My Mouth. I mean Fitness to Purpose. Entirely pointless. Yeah, I can hear some minor differences if I do some A/B testing, but again, why? Finally, an instrumental version of Murderous. I love Murderous. It's a great song, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's just the album track minus the vocals. And again, why? Is this for the DJs out there? But keep in mind that this is a CD, and there are not a lot of DJs mixing off of CDs. And the bonus track wasn't on the vinyl. That's kind of why it was a bonus track. So what's this for? Is it for karaoke? I don't know. No idea. So yeah, they pad out this CD an extra 15 minutes, but really I'd rather just scrap that stuff and have the album version of, Warsaw Ghetto on here. Or maybe the 12-inch version of Let Your Body Learn, since they cheap me out here on the album version. So I don't know. They did what they did, but that's the album. My CD is about 55 minutes long, maybe 40 minutes if you hack off these bonus tracks. So why do I love it? Obviously, this is a very important album in the history of industrial and EBM. I think it perfectly demonstrates Nitzer Ebb's unique sound, how it's minimalistic but very powerful. Musically, the band clearly owed a debt to earlier bands, especially DAF. I find a lot of similarity between them, but, DAF doesn't have Douglas McCarthy or Bon Harris on vocals. And in this band, Nitzer Ebb, vocals count for a lot. It's not just Doug's voice, which is very unique and awesome and powerful and cool. It's also in his lyrics and his delivery. They created a whole style with this album. There was nothing else out there that sounded quite like it, which is really saying something, and they would evolve a lot, of course, in coming years, and this was really just the starting point for this incredible journey that they went on. Their first run as a band was really just 5 albums, and I can tell you that the 5th album doesn't sound a lot like this. Each album would be a little poppier than the last, to the point where they evolved so much that they largely lost their core audience. People like me who were more into their early unique club sound and who didn't really want them to turn into another information society. So, this album is special in that it's in some ways an idealized version of the band, really just boiled down to its core essence. They're not trying to convey any complex emotions here. That total age, like I said, speaks directly to your reptile brain. This is boot camp. It's not a PhD thesis. This is hunting through the dark and killing your prey with your teeth, not a night at the tavern on the green. And, who doesn't need that from time to time to just shut off your prefrontal cortex for a while? Even me, a 50-something desk jockey, I need that lower brain hit now and then. And this album gives it to me, and that's why I love it. So what happened next? Well, again, go listen to episodes 48 and 2 in that order, and that will take you through the next 2 albums, Belief and Showtime, which is where I got on the Nitzer Ebb fandom train shortly after Showtime came out. I have a lot to say about their 4th album, Ebbhead, which I will get to in due time. It's the first album of theirs that I had to wait for, and maybe the first one that really defied my expectations. It pretty much redefined everything I thought about the band up to that point, and in some ways it lifted the veil, that mystique. They had started getting some press. They weren't as much of a mystery. So things changed, as they have a way of doing, but that's a story for another day. So there you have it, folks. A classic industrial and EBM album, if there ever was one. It's iconic, you might say, and still a club favorite at your local 80s goth night. Nitzer Ebb's That Total Age, one of those albums that even if you hated the music, you knew it would look great in your collection. It just looks awesome. Fortunately, the music does back up the excellent design. It's truly an album for the ages and still sounds like it was made by a bunch of techno cavemen huffing pure adrenaline. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that would like to get a dog someday. I'd get that dog and name it Paul. A barker named Paul. Paul Barker. Get it? Get it? As always, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.